before this entire ditch is under 15 feet of river. Inside the dead luxury sedan, Baek-hyeon jiggled the door handle desperately. The electrical system was completely fried, locking him inside his own $200,000 coffin. The freezing floodwater was already seeping through the floorboards, soaking his bespoke wool trousers. Outside, a woman in a bright yellow rain slicker was furiously wiping mud from his window, her flashing lights sweeping across his face. When the electronic lock wouldn't budge, she didn't hesitate. She reversed the flashlight and slammed the heavy metal butt of it against the driver's side glass. Ker-ack! The glass webbed. Another brutal strike, and it shattered inward. Baek-hyeon shielded his face, then slammed his shoulder against the weakened frame. He forced the door open against the crushing weight of the rising creek. Instantly, the brutal storm battered him, stripping away the last of his executive dignity. He stumbled into the waist-deep torrent, mud pulling at his expensive Italian leather shoes. Before the current could sweep him away, the woman grabbed his arm. Her grip was ferocious, unyielding. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like fury itself as she fought the elements to drag him toward the steep embankment. Move. Up the bank, she ordered, pushing him ahead of her, using her own body to shield him from rushing debris. They scrambled up the slick, muddy incline on their hands and knees. Just as they reached the crest, a massive, deafening surge of brown water swallowed the road below. Baek-hyeon collapsed on the gravel shoulder, breath ripping from his lungs, as he watched the flash flood bury his car. "Don't look back. Get in," she shouted, throwing open the passenger door of a rusted, sputtering pickup truck parked precariously close to the edge. He crawled inside, shattering. Zariah jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and jammed the old truck into gear. The tires spun on the wet gravel for a heart-stopping second before finally finding purchase. They shot down the dark, unpaved logging road, leaving the disaster behind. Inside the cab, the heater was blasting a loud, dry warmth that smelled of old coffee and vanilla. Baek-hyeon's teeth chattered uncontrollably. The roar of the wind was muffled now, replaced by the laboring whine of the old engine. He looked over at the woman who had just saved his life. Her braids were pulled back under a baseball cap, her jaw set in tight concentration as she navigated the treacherous, muddy path through the blinding downpour. "You're lucky I was taking the long way home from my shift at the care home," she said, her voice softer now, but still carrying the authoritative resonance of someone who handled crises daily. She glanced at him. "I'm Zariah." Baek-hyeon, he managed to get out, his voice rough. He waited for the inevitable shift in tone, the sudden obsequiousness that always followed that name. "Okay, Baek-hyeon," Zariah replied simply, turning her eyes back to the road. She didn't look impressed. To her, he wasn't the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. He was just a stranger she'd plucked from a watery grave. 15 minutes later, the truck pulled into the gravel driveway of a small, modest bungalow with a slightly peeling wraparound porch. It was light years away from the sterile, glass penthouse he usually occupied. They bolted through the rain to the front door. As she unlocked it, Zariah essentially pushed him into the warm interior. Amber light filled the cozy living room. The house was small, but radiated a sense of peace that Baek-hyeon hadn't felt in years. He could smell cinnamon and simmering broth. "Shoes off there," she directed, shedding her rain slicker. "The bathroom is the first door. Take a hot shower before pneumonia sets in. You look like a half-drowned rat. I'll leave some dry clothes outside the door." He stood in the entryway, entirely disarmed by her brusque hospitality. In Baek-hyeon's world, every interaction was a negotiation, and every favor came with a heavy price tag. He watched her disappear into a closet, her mind focused entirely on making sure he was warm and fed. By the time he stepped out of the steaming shower, the terrifying chill was finally out of his bones. He found a stack of faded soft sweats and a thick university sweatshirt waiting for him. They were miles too big for him, but they were warm and smelled of lavender detergent. Dressing in them felt like shedding a layer of armor he hadn't realized he was wearing. When he walked into the kitchen, Zariah was stirring something on the stove. She gestured to a scuffed wooden table. He sat, and she placed a massive ceramic bowl of rich chicken and dumpling stew in front of him, followed by 2 thick slices of homemade bread. He looked down at the food, the comforting aroma suddenly making his throat tight. He reached into the pocket of his ruined suit, which was draped over a chair, and pulled out his Patek Philippe watch. The platinum and diamonds were crusted in mud, but the movement was still perfect. He slid the priceless piece across the table toward her. "I don't have cash on me," Baek-hyun said quietly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "But this will more than cover your time, your food, and your truck." Zaraya paused, looking at the fortune glittering next to her salt shaker. Then she looked at his face. Her expression didn't change, she didn't look greedy, and she didn't look insulted. She was just tired. With a calm, steady hand, she reached out and pushed the watch right back across the table toward him. "I don't charge for saving lives, Baek-hyun," she said softly, sitting down in the chair across from him. "Keep your watch. Just eat the soup before it gets cold." For the first time in his entire life, the man who owned everything realized he had absolutely nothing to give the only woman who wanted nothing from him, but to see him safe. The morning sun broke through the dissipating storm clouds, casting a fractured, brilliant light across the faded patchwork quilt draped over Baek-hyun's chest. He woke up instantly, his body bracing for a threat out of pure habit. His hand reached beneath the pillow, searching for the cold steel of the firearm he usually kept close. There was nothing but soft cotton. He sat up slowly, the joints in his broad shoulders popping as he took in his surroundings. He wasn't in his heavily guarded penthouse city estate. He was on a slightly saggy, comfortable sofa in a home that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and lavender. Through the window, the world outside was damp and sparkling, the catastrophic flood of the previous night reduced to a hum of dripping gutters and singing birds. From the kitchen, a rhythmic, metallic clinking sound echoed. Baek-hyun stood up, running a hand through his dark, messy hair. He adjusted the oversized university sweatshirt Zaraya had lent him, rolling up the sleeves. As he did, the intricate, sharp lines of a dark tattoo winding from his wrist up to his forearm became visible, a stark remnant of a life dictated by cold authority and heavy expectations. He walked quietly into the kitchen, his bare feet making no sound on the worn linoleum. Zaraya was standing by the stove, her back to him. Her hair was tied up into a high, neat bun, exposing the graceful line of her neck. She was packing a modest lunchbox with Tupperware containers, while simultaneously watching a small pot of oatmeal bubble on the burner. Her movements were brisk and efficient, the posture of a woman who didn't have a single second of her day to waste. Baek-hyun's gaze drifted past her to the kitchen counter. There, tucked beneath a ceramic fruit bowl, was a small stack of papers. Even from a distance, his sharp corporate eyes caught the bold red lettering, "Past due final notice." It was a bill for a roofing company. He looked up at the kitchen ceiling and noticed a faint, circular water stain right above the pantry. A slow drip landing into a small plastic bucket on the floor. The proud, capable woman who had pulled him from a sinking vehicle without asking for a dime was quietly drowning under the weight of her own everyday burdens. "You're up," Zaraya said without turning around, as if she could sense his powerful presence in the small room. She turned the burner off and faced him, offering a small, tired smile that reached her warm, dark eyes. "How are you feeling? Did you catch a chill?" "I'm fine," Baek-hyun said, his deep voice carrying a rough morning gravel. "I slept well. Better than I have in a long time, actually." "Good. There's coffee in the pot, and the oatmeal is ready." "Help yourself," she said, snapping her lunchbox shut. She glanced at her watch, a cheap, plastic digital timepiece that contrasted sharply with the luxury item he had offered her the night before. "I have to run. I'm taking an extra shift at the clinic today, and if I'm late, the morning meds get delayed." Baek-hyun walked over to the counter, pouring himself a mug of black coffee. "What about my car? Is there a local towing service I can call?" Zaraya let out a soft, breathy laugh, slinging a canvas tote bag over her shoulder. "The entire Lower Valley Road is completely washed out, Baek-hyun. The county sheriff put out an alert this morning. No one is getting in or out of this ridge for at least 48 hours until the water recedes and the debris is cleared." Cell towers are down across the county line too, Baekhyun tensed slightly. He was trapped. Cut off from his empire, his executives, and his security detail. In the past, a situation like this would have triggered absolute paranoia. His rivals could use his absence to destabilize his legitimate business transitions. But as he looked out the window at the quiet, peaceful woods surrounding her property, an unfamiliar feeling washed over him. Relief. For 48 hours, he didn't have to be the ruthless, unyielding chairman. He could just exist. So, Zaraya continued, stepping into her worn sneakers by the door. You're stuck here. The fridge is fully stocked, and there's fresh bread in the bread box. Don't worry about the house, just make yourself at home. I should be back by 6 this evening. She reached for the doorknob, but Baekhyun stepped forward, his tall, imposing frame naturally commanding the space between them. Zaraya, she stopped, looking up at him, entirely unfazed by his height or the intense, focused look in his eyes. You are leaving a stranger alone in your house, Baekhyun pointed out, his voice quiet, testing her. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I am capable of. In the city, people lock 3 deadbolts just to keep men like me away. Zaraya looked at him for a long, silent moment. She didn't look at his sharp, aristocratic facial features or the dark tattoo on his arm with fear. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes, reading the profound, hidden exhaustion underneath his guarded exterior. A bad man wouldn't have offered me a Patek Philippe watch to pay for a bowl of soup, Baekhyun, she said softly, her tone carrying an unwavering, deep trust that shook him to his core. And a bad man wouldn't look as tired of the world as you do. Lock the screen door behind me. I'll see you tonight. With that, she slipped out the door. The old pickup truck engine sputtering to life outside before fading down the gravel driveway. The house fell into a profound, heavy silence. Baekhyun stood in the kitchen, sipping the hot, strong coffee. He looked at the plastic bucket, catching the slow drip from the ceiling. Drip, drip. A slow, deliberate smile touched the corners of his lips. He set his coffee mug down and walked toward the small utility closet he had noticed near the bathroom. If he couldn't leave, and if she wouldn't accept his money, he would pay his debt in a language he hadn't spoken since he was a young man working his way up from the bottom. Manual labor. He found a toolbox, a sturdy ladder on the back porch, and a tarp. For the next several hours, the billionaire who controlled boardrooms became a common handyman. He climbed up onto the roof, the morning air crisp against his skin. He found the loose shingles shifted by the storm, meticulously resetting them and securing the weatherproofing. He didn't care about the grease on his hands or the dust coating the borrowed sweatshirt. By the afternoon, he had repaired the roof, fixed a loose floorboard on the front porch that Zaraya had tripped over the night before, and thoroughly cleaned her small kitchen. He even managed to find an old, rusted lawnmower in the shed, clearing the overgrown grass until the modest property looked pristine. When the clock neared 5:30, Baekhyun showered, changed back into the clean sweats, and began preparing a simple dinner using the ingredients in her pantry. He chopped vegetables with absolute precision, his focus entirely consumed by the quiet, meditative piece of the task. At exactly 6 o'clock, the familiar sound of the old pickup truck echoed in the driveway. Zaraya walked through the front door, her shoulders slumped with absolute exhaustion after a 12-hour shift. She looked drained, her eyes fixed on the floor as she kicked off her sneakers. But the moment she stepped into the kitchen, she froze. The air was filled with the rich, savory aroma of garlic, soy sauce, and seared beef. The kitchen counters were spotless. The plastic bucket on the pantry floor was gone, replaced by a perfectly dry ceiling. She looked up, her jaw dropping slightly as she saw Baekhyun standing by the stove, a wooden spatula in his hand, looking at her with a calm, expectant warmth. The leak is fixed, Baekhyun said quietly, stepping aside to reveal the beautifully prepared dinner waiting on the table. And dinner is served. You look like you've had a long day, Zaraya. Sit down. Zaraya stared at the table, then at the ceiling, and finally at him. For a moment, she didn't say a word. Then, a soft, incredibly tender laugh escaped her lips, her entire body relaxing as the heavy tension of her day completely evaporated. "You are a very strange castaway, Baek-hyeon," she whispered, walking over to the table. Her heart swelling with a strange, beautiful warmth she hadn't felt in a very long time. As they sat down to eat together in the golden light of the evening, the invisible walls between the hardened corporate king and the independent woman began to crumble, replaced by the quiet, undeniable foundation of mutual trust. The evening stretched out into a gentle, quiet rhythm, enveloped by the soft, persistent patter of residual rain against the bungalow's window panes. Inside, the lingering aroma of seared beef and garlic faded into the sweet, earthy scent of the chamomile tea Zariah was brewing. A small, oscillating space heater hummed in the corner of the kitchen, casting a warm, orange glow across the scuffed linoleum floor. Baek-hyeon stood at the ceramic sink, his large hands submerged in warm, soapy water, as he methodically scrubbed the dinner plates. For a man who employed a staff of dozens just to maintain his private residence, the mundane task of washing dishes should have felt demeaning. Instead, it felt profoundly grounding. The hot water on his skin. The simple, immediate result of scrubbing a plate clean, it was honest work. There were no hidden agendas in a sink full of suds. As he rinsed the final glass and set it on the drying rack, he dried his hands on a kitchen towel and turned around. Zariah was sitting at the small wooden table, bathed in the dim light of a single overhead bulb. She had changed out of her work scrubs into a soft, oversized knitted sweater that hung off one shoulder, her braids pulled into a loose, comfortable wrap. She was staring down at her left hand, her brow furrowed in a slight wince as she rubbed her thumb over a harsh, red burn mark across her inner wrist, an occupational hazard from handling commercial food warmers at the care home. Baek-hyeon's posture, which had been trained by years of corporate warfare to remain rigid, imposing, and untouchable, completely softened. The tight coil of tension at the base of his neck, a constant companion in his glass-walled boardroom, vanished without a word. He walked out of the kitchen and navigated the short hallway to the bathroom. He remembered seeing a small, white plastic first aid kit on the shelf when he had showered. He retrieved a tube of burn ointment and a sterile gauze pad, carrying them back into the kitchen. Zariah looked up, slightly startled as the imposing, incredibly handsome man pulled out the chair directly adjacent to hers and sat down. He didn't ask for permission, nor did he make a grand gesture. He simply reached out and gently took her injured hand in his. The contrast between them was striking. Baek-hyeon's hands were large, calloused, and marked by the faint, faded scars of a violent past he was desperately trying to leave behind. Zariah's skin was a rich, flawless melanin, soft and warm, yet carrying the quiet strength of a woman who worked tirelessly for everything she had. "You didn't mention you were hurt," Baek-hyeon said, his deep voice barely above a murmur. "It's just a scrape from the heating trays," Zariah replied softly, her breath catching slightly as his large thumb lightly brushed the sensitive skin just below the burn. "I barely noticed it." "You are terrible at lying, Zariah," he murmured, his dark eyes flickering up to meet hers with a gentle, knowing warmth. He uncapped the ointment and applied a small, cooling dab to her wrist. His touch was incredibly slow, deliberate, and light, the touch of a man who knew his own devastating strength and was consciously choosing to be as gentle as a whisper. Zariah watched his face, mesmerized by the sharp, aristocratic slope of his jaw and the intense, absolute focus he dedicated to this tiny, insignificant injury. "I'm supposed to be the caregiver in this house," Zariah chuckled softly, the sound slightly breathless. "Even caregivers need to be cared for," Baek-hyeon replied, securely taping the edge of the gauze. He didn't let go of her hand right away. His thumb slowly stroked the back of her knuckles. He looked into her warm brown eyes, the sheer exhaustion of his double life suddenly rising to the surface. "Who takes care of you, Zariah?" The question hung in the warm air, heavy and intimate. Zariah's smile faltered, replaced by a look of profound, relatable vulnerability. "I've been on my own for a long time, Baek-hyeon. When you have to keep a roof over your head and the lights on, you don't really have the luxury of waiting for someone to carry the load. You just brace your shoulders and keep walking." She paused, looking down at their joined hands. "But my grandmother used to tell me that God doesn't give us heavy burdens to break our backs. He gives them to us, so we eventually learn when to surrender, when to hand them over." "I'm still learning how to let go." Baek Hyun felt a strange, tight ache in his chest. In his world, surrendering meant death. Showing a weakness meant an enemy would immediately exploit it. His entire empire was built on the terrifying premise that he could never, under any circumstances, let his guard down. But sitting here, in this tiny, peeling kitchen, smelling of chamomile and rain, he realized he wanted to surrender everything. He wanted to strip away the title, the wealth, and the syndicate, and just be the man holding this woman's hand. "It takes a tremendous amount of strength to face the world alone," Baek Hyun said softly, his voice vibrating with absolute sincerity. "But you shouldn't have to." Zariah looked up at him, really looking past the handsome face and the imposing frame. She saw a man who carried a weight just as heavy as hers, if not heavier. "And what about you, Baek Hyun? Who tells you to rest?" "No one," he answered honestly, the truth slipping past his lips before he could stop it. "Until I crashed into your river." Suddenly, the overhead bulb flickered rapidly before completely dying out. The county's strained power grid had finally given way. The house plunged into darkness, save for the bright, dancing orange light of the battery-operated lantern Zariah kept on the counter. Instead of panic, a heavy, beautiful peace settled over the room. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the rare, comfortable stillness of mutual understanding. Baek Hyun didn't let go of her hand. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the dim amber glow, listening to the rain tap against the glass. As he watched the soft light illuminate the graceful slope of Zariah's neck and the peaceful relaxation in her face, Baek Hyun closed his eyes for a brief second. For the first time in his adult life, the billionaire offered up a quiet, profound prayer of gratitude. He didn't pray for wealth, or power, or the destruction of his enemies. He simply thanked whatever divine grace had flooded that back road, shattered his expensive car, and washed him directly to the safest place on earth. He didn't want the roads to clear. He just wanted to stay right here. The third morning arrived with a crisp, cool breeze that finally drove the heavy storm clouds away, replacing them with an endless blanket of pale blue sky. The floodwaters in the lower valley were beginning to recede, but according to the static, heavy county radio report Zariah had turned on during breakfast, the main roads were still choked with mud and fallen timber. For at least one more day, the rest of the world was entirely locked out, and Baek Hyun was locked in. He stood on the front porch, the morning sun catching the sharp, aristocratic lines of his profile. He was wearing a fresh pair of dark denim jeans and a simple navy blue Henley shirt that Zariah had retrieved from a storage trunk in the hallway clothes that had belonged to her late uncle. The shirt fit snugly across Baek Hyun's broad shoulders, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, exposing the intricate, dark ink of the tattoo that wrapped around his forearm. To anyone passing by, he looked like a remarkably handsome, hard-working local man. Only the undeniable power in his posture and the intense, calculating gaze in his dark eyes betrayed the truth. He was a man accustomed to commanding empires. Through the screen door, he could hear the rhythmic clinking of a calculator and the frustrated sigh of a woman who had reached her absolute limit. Baek Hyun turned and walked back inside, his bare feet moving silently across the hardwood floor. He stopped at the entrance of the small dining room. Zariah was sitting at the table, completely surrounded by a chaotic sea of paperwork. Manila folders were stacked high, medical billing ledgers were spread open, and that familiar, threatening stack of red, stamped past due notices sat right at her right hand. She was furiously typing numbers into an old digital calculator, a pencil tucked behind her ear, her soft braids falling over her shoulders as she bent over the desk. She looked beautiful, but she also looked entirely overwhelmed. A faint line of tension was etched between her brows, and her lower lip was caught between her teeth, a subconscious habit Baek Hyun had noticed whenever she was trying to force a solution out of a problem that simply didn't have one. Quietly, without making a sound, Baek Hyon walked into the kitchen, poured a fresh mug of black coffee, and carried it over to the table. He set it down gently, right next to her calculator. Zariah blinked, startled out of her intense focus. She looked up, her warm dark eyes meeting his. She offered a small, defensive smile, instinctively leaning over the paperwork as if she could physically shield her financial struggles from his sharp gaze. "Thanks for the coffee. Sorry for the mess. I usually do the facility's administrative books at the clinic, but since I'm stuck here today, I thought I'd tackle the home expenses. It's a puzzle." Baek Hyon didn't pull away. Instead of returning to the living room, he pulled out the heavy wooden chair directly across from her and sat down. He rested his large forearms on the table, his dark eyes calmly scanning the layout of her documents. "You are running a non-profit care facility's operational budget on a standard household income ledger," Baek Hyon observed, his deep voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a man who spent 12 hours a day restructuring multi-billion-dollar corporate entities. "The state subsidies for your patients are being delayed by 30 days. But your vendor invoices for medical supplies are on a strict 14-day net cycle. You are constantly pulling from your personal savings just to bridge the 2-week gap so your residents don't lose their care." Zariah's posture immediately stiffened. Her stubborn, fiercely independent nature flared up like a wall of fire. She slammed her pencil down on the table, her jaw tightening as she looked at him. "I didn't ask you to audit my life, Baek Hyon. I'm handling it. It's my responsibility, and I've kept this place afloat and this house standing for 4 years on my own. I don't need a corporate billionaire looking down his nose at my numbers." The outburst would have terrified any executive in the city. When Baek Hyon was angry, boardrooms cleared out in seconds. But looking at Zariah, he felt absolutely no anger. He only felt a profound, aching respect. "I am not looking down my nose at you, Zariah," he said softly, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly gentle register that completely disarmed her anger. He reached across the table, his large hand resting flat on the wooden surface, just inches from hers. "In my world, people use money to buy loyalty, to control others, or to hide their weaknesses. You use every single penny you have to protect people who cannot protect themselves. You are the strongest person I have ever met, but even the strongest generals need a strategist." Zariah looked down at his hand, her chest heaving slightly as her stubborn defenses began to fracture. The sheer weight of carrying everything alone, the roof, the care home, the bills, the lives of the elderly residents who depended on her, suddenly felt massive. She let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders dropping as she finally let go of her defensive posture. "It's a losing battle this month," she admitted quietly, her voice thick with a relatable, raw vulnerability. "The roofing company wants the final payment by Friday, and if I pay them, I won't have enough to clear the food shipment for the clinic on Monday. I've prayed about it. I've worked double shifts, and I still can't make the pieces fit." "Then let me fit them for you," Baek Hyon said firmly. He didn't offer to just write a check, because he knew her pride would never allow it. He knew that to truly honor her, he had to work with her, not just hand her a solution from above. "I cannot access my bank accounts until the cellular towers are rebuilt, but my mind is completely functional. Let me be your partner today." Zariah searched his face for a long, silent moment. She saw no pity in his eyes, only a deep, unwavering respect, and an absolute eagerness to help. Slowly, a small, genuine smile broke through her exhaustion. She picked up a spare blue pen and slid a blank legal pad across the table toward him. "All right, Chairman," she murmured, a playful, warm spark returning to her eyes. "Show me what you've got." For the next 4 hours, the small dining room transformed into a sanctuary of pure partnership. Side by side, they went through every single line item. Baek Hyon worked with a brilliant, staggering efficiency. But he never cut Zariah out of the process. He explained every move, showing her how to legally restructure her vendor contracts, how to file for immediate emergency state grants due to the flood, and how to optimize her daily operational costs without sacrificing an ounce of quality for her patients. As they worked, their bodies naturally drifted closer, their shoulders brushed in the small space, and occasionally, when pointing out a specific figure on a spreadsheet, Bayek Hyon's large hand would cover hers, guiding her pen. The romantic tension between them was thick, electric, and completely undeniable, yet it was grounded in a deep sense of mutual trust and respect. By the time the afternoon sun began to cast long, golden shadows across the room, the chaotic mountain of paperwork had been reduced to 3 neat, organized folders. The legal pad was covered in a flawless, step-by-step financial recovery strategy that didn't just solve her problem for the month, it secured her facility for the next 3 years. Zoraya stared at the final numbers, her jaw slightly open. The heavy, suffocating cloud of anxiety that had been hanging over her head for months had completely vanished. She looked over at Bayek Hyon, her eyes shining with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. "You're a genius," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't even know what to say. You just saved everything I've built." Bayek Hyon turned his head, his face just inches from hers. The sharp, intimidating corporate king was entirely gone, replaced by a man whose heart was completely full. He reached out, his long fingers gently tucking a stray braid behind her ear, his thumb lingering for a brief, breathtaking second against the soft skin of her jawline. "You saved my life from a river, Zoraya," Bayek Hyon said, his deep voice vibrating with absolute, raw sincerity. "All I did was organize some paper. The pleasure was entirely mine." Zoraya's breath hitched at the intensity of his gaze. In that quiet, golden hour, as they sat side by side in the absolute peace of the home they had protected together, she realized that the mysterious, grumpy stranger she had dragged out of the mud was no longer a stranger at all. He was the answer to a prayer she hadn't even known she was praying. The crackle of the old kitchen radio broke the stillness of the 4th morning, the static finally giving way to a clear, authoritative broadcast. The county sheriff's voice echoed through the small house, announcing that the heavy machinery had finally broken through the debris on the lower valley ridge. The roads were officially open. The cellular towers were coming back online. The outside world was rushing back in, whether they were ready for it or not. Zoraya stood at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of peppermint tea. She stared out the window, a heavy, unnameable ache settling deep in her chest. For the past 3 days, this tiny, isolated farmhouse had existed in a perfect, untouchable bubble. Inside these walls, there were no boardrooms, no syndicates, no crushing bills, and no lonely nights. There was only the quiet, steady rhythm of a true partnership. But reality was knocking on the door, and reality meant the billionaire in her spare clothes was going to leave. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of her faded denim overalls, and walked toward the back door. When she stepped out onto the porch, the cool morning air rushed over her, carrying the sharp, clean scent of damp earth and pine needles. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Bayek Hyon was not packing to leave. He was knee-deep in the thick mud of her backyard. The floodwaters had completely decimated the small, raised vegetable garden Zoraya painstakingly maintained to help feed the residents at the care clinic. The wooden retaining walls had collapsed, the soil washed away, and the delicate seedlings completely uprooted. It was a loss she had quietly mourned, but hadn't had the time to fix. Now, the most powerful man in the city was covered in dirt, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he swung a heavy sledgehammer, driving a new wooden stake deep into the earth. He had found scrap lumber in her shed and was systematically, meticulously rebuilding her garden beds from scratch. His jaw was set with absolute focus, the muscles in his broad back shifting beneath the thin cotton of his borrowed shirt with every powerful swing. Zoraya watched him, completely mesmerized by the sheer, beautiful contrast of the man. He had a mind sharp enough to rewrite her entire financial future in an afternoon, yet he possessed the profound, humble kindness to stand in the mud and swing a hammer just to save her tomatoes. She walked down the porch steps, carrying a tall glass of ice water. "You're going to pull a muscle, Chairman," she called out softly, her voice attempting a light-hearted tease to mask the deep emotion swelling in her throat. Bayek Hyon paused, resting the head of the sledgehammer on the ground. He turned to look at her, wiping a streak of sweat and dirt from his forehead with the back of his forearm. When his dark eyes locked onto hers, the intense, unwavering warmth in them made her heart hammer against her ribs. He walked over to the edge of the rebuilt garden bed, taking the glass of water from her hands. The structural integrity of the old wood was compromised, Baek-hyun stated matter-of-factly, taking a long drink of the water. He set the glass down on a nearby stump and looked out over the fresh, dark soil he had just packed into the new frames. I reinforced the corners. When the spring rains come again, this soil won't move an inch. Your harvest will be safe. Zariah looked at the beautiful, sturdy garden beds, then back up at him. You heard the radio broadcast, didn't you? I heard it, he replied quietly, the authoritative resonance of his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. Your people are probably turning the city upside down looking for you, Zariah said, forcing a brave, pragmatic smile. She crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly feeling incredibly vulnerable. You have a corporate empire to run, Baek-hyun. You have board meetings, executives, and a life that is 1,000,000 miles away from a muddy backyard in the valley. You don't have to stay out here swinging a hammer to repay me. We're square. Baek-hyun stepped closer, entirely unbothered by the dirt on his clothes. He closed the physical distance between them until he was standing just inches away. His towering height naturally sheltering her from the cool morning breeze. He reached out, gently wrapping his large, calloused hands around her forearms, unraveling her defensive posture. Stop doing that, Baek-hyun said, his tone incredibly gentle but lined with absolute firmness. Doing what? Zariah whispered, looking up into his eyes. Pushing me toward the exit because you are terrified I'm going to walk through it, he answered with devastating honesty. He slowly slid his hands down her arms until his fingers intertwined with hers, holding her hands gently against his chest so she could feel the steady, rhythmic beating of his heart. For the last 10 years, I have lived in a fortress of glass and steel. I have wealth that most people cannot even fathom. But my life, Zariah, was completely empty. It was a cold, paranoid existence where every person I met wanted something from me, and every decision I made was a battle for survival. Zariah swallowed hard, completely captivated by the raw, unfiltered vulnerability he was pouring out to her. Then my car sank into a river, and you pulled me into the light, Baek-hyun continued, his thumb gently caressing the back of her hand. You gave me warm food, dry clothes, and absolute peace. You trusted me in your home, when you had every reason not to. You didn't care about my title, my bank accounts, or my power. You just cared about me. Sitting at your kitchen table, helping you balance your ledgers, and building this garden, it is the first time in my entire life I have ever felt completely alive. Tears pricked the corners of Zariah's eyes. She had spent so many years being the strong one, the caregiver, the woman who held everything together for everyone else. Hearing this magnificent, powerful man tell her that she was his sanctuary shattered the last remaining wall around her heart. But you still have to go back, she whispered, a single tear slipping down her cheek. You have a responsibility to your family's legacy. Baek-hyun reached up, his large, dirt-smudged hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb wiped away the tear with infinite tenderness. I do have to go back to the city to finalize the transition of my companies, he agreed quietly. But I am not leaving you behind, Zariah. Not today. Not ever. Before she could process the weight of his promise, a low, mechanical rumble echoed through the trees. Down at the base of the gravel driveway, the flashing yellow lights of a county road-clearing truck came into view, followed closely by a sleek, black luxury SUV. His security detail had found him. The isolation was officially over. Baek-hyun didn't even look toward the driveway. His eyes remained entirely fixed on Zariah, holding her gaze with a fierce, unwavering devotion that anchored her soul. Let them wait, Baek-hyun murmured softly. He leaned down, his face closing the final inch between them, and pressed his lips to her forehead in a long, lingering kiss of pure, absolute reverence. It wasn't a demanding kiss. It was a profound, silent promise. It was a declaration that the ruthless corporate king had finally found his queen, and he was completely, willingly surrendering his crown for the peace he found in her arms. The sleek, heavily armored SUV looked entirely alien parked on the muddy gravel of Zariah's humble driveway. 3 men in immaculate dark suits had stepped out, their expressions rigid, waiting for their employer. But Bayek Hayon hadn't rushed. He had stood on the porch, holding Zariah's gaze for a long, silent minute, communicating everything that words could not fully capture. Then, he had walked down the steps, climbed into the back seat, and vanished down the newly cleared valley road. For the first few days, the farmhouse felt profoundly, achingly empty. Zariah found herself listening for the heavy, quiet cadence of his footsteps on the hardwood floor, or looking toward the kitchen expecting to see his broad shoulders hunched over her paperwork. But she didn't let the silence break her. She leaned into her faith, offering quiet prayers of gratitude for the brief, beautiful season of rest he had given her, and returned to her grueling routine at the care clinic. 3 weeks passed. The floodwaters became a distant memory, replaced by the lush, vibrant green of early spring. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the miracles began. Zariah was in the staff break room at the Pine Haven Care Facility, rubbing her tired eyes after a long morning of patient rounds. The facility director, an older, worn-down man named Mr. Henderson, burst through the swinging doors holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. His hands were physically shaking. "Zariah," he breathed, sinking into the chair across from her. "You need to see this." I can't even believe what I am reading." He slid a heavy, embossed document across the table. Zariah frowned, picking it up. It was a legally binding notice of funding from a newly established philanthropic entity called the Riverstone Trust. As her eyes scanned the meticulously typed pages, her heart stopped. The trust had fully paid off the clinic's mortgage. Furthermore, it had established a permanent, irrevocable endowment that guaranteed full operational funding, medical supplies, and staff salary increases for the next 20 years. There were no loopholes, no corporate demands, and no strings attached. It was an absolute, flawless financial shield. At the very bottom of the document, in the section detailing the structural management of the endowment, there was a single, familiar line of strategy. It was the exact, brilliant financial framework Bayek Hayon had sketched out on her legal pad at her dining room table. He hadn't just paid her bills, he had fundamentally dismantled the systemic burden that was crushing her, securing a future where she would never have to worry about the survival of her patients ever again. He had used his staggering power not to conquer, but to protect. Tears spilled over Zariah's lashes, dropping onto the cream paper. Miss Henderson was weeping openly, thanking God for the answered prayer, entirely unaware of the magnificent, quiet man who had orchestrated the deliverance. Zariah just pressed her hand to her chest, feeling a warmth so profound it completely took her breath away. By the time Sunday evening arrived, a deep, beautiful peace had settled over Zariah's life. She sat on the front porch of her farmhouse, a mug of chamomile tea resting on the railing. The sun was dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of amber and violet. The wooden floorboard beneath her rocking chair didn't squeak. Bayek Hayon had fixed it perfectly. In the backyard, the sturdy, reinforced garden beds were already sprouting tiny green shoots of new life. The crunch of tires on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. Zariah stood up, her pulse instantly accelerating. But it wasn't a fleet of terrifying black SUVs. It was a modest, dark blue sedan. The engine cut off, and the driver's side door opened. Bayek Hayon stepped out into the golden evening light. He looked entirely different. The bespoke, restrictive corporate suits were gone. He was wearing dark slacks and a soft, charcoal gray cashmere sweater that made his broad shoulders look relaxed, approachable, and deeply comforting. The harsh, guarded edge that usually hardened his jawline had completely melted away. He looked like a man who had finally put down a crushing weight. He walked up the pathway, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world completely fade away. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. "I received a letter from the Riverstone Trust," Zariah whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She walked down the steps until she was standing right in front of him. "Bayek Hayon," You gave us the entire world. You saved the clinic. You saved my peace. Baek Hyeon reached out, his large hands gently wrapping around her waist, pulling her effortlessly into his solid, warm chest. I simply executed the strategy we built together, he murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble against her ear. You are the one doing the holy work, Zariah. I just made sure you had the armor to keep doing it. She looked up at him, her hands resting flat against the soft cashmere of his sweater, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. What happens now? What about your empire? I spent the last 3 weeks restructuring the entire syndicate, Baek Hyeon explained softly, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her cheek. I transferred the legitimate commercial holdings to a trusted board of directors, and I dissolved the rest. I stepped down as chairman. I kept only the philanthropic branch, the Riverstone Trust. I don't want to rule a city anymore, Zariah. I don't want the power, and I don't want the war. Zariah's breath hitched. Then what do you want? Baek Hyeon leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as he breathed in the sweet, familiar scent of vanilla and rain that always lingered on her skin. I want this, he confessed, his voice breaking with pure, unadulterated emotion. I want to wake up and drink coffee at a scuffed wooden table. I want to build garden beds in the mud. I want to hold the hand of the most incredible woman I have ever known. And I want to spend the rest of my life thanking God that a storm washed my old life away so I could finally find my way home. He didn't wait for her to answer. He didn't have to. Zariah rose on her tiptoes, wrapping her arms around his neck, and pulled him down into a deep, passionate kiss. It was a kiss that tasted of absolute surrender, of answered prayers, and of a future built entirely on trust. Baek Hyeon's arms tightened around her, lifting her slightly off the ground, anchoring her against him as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon. The billionaire had lost his empire, but as he stood on the quiet porch of the woman who had saved him, he knew he was the wealthiest man on earth. If you loved this beautiful journey of emotional healing, unbreakable trust, and a love that transcends power and wealth, please hit the like button and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that true strength is found in kindness. What was your favorite moment between Baek Hyeon and Zariah? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new, heartwarming romance story. I will see you tomorrow in the next story.